Hello everyone and a warm welcome to today's webinar. We are fortunate to have esteemed personality Honorable Justice V.M. Kanade sir to provide his valuable knowledge and guidance on the topic Law of Writs. Justice V.M. Kanade sir started practicing in the High Court, Bombay in June 1979. Initially up to 1984, he also appeared in Metropolitan Magistrate Courts, Mumbai, City Civil and Session Courts, Mumbai and conducted session trials and civil suits. He appeared in High Court, Bombay in civil, criminal and constitutional cases. He had worked as assistant government pleader from 1988 to 1990 in Writ Cell, High Court Panel Counsel for Union of India from 1986 to 1989, a Panel Counsel for State of Maharashtra from 1992 to 2000. He has appeared on behalf of various government corporations. He has appeared in election petitions filed under the Representation of People Act 1950 in the High Court, appeared on behalf of educational institutions in various educational matters. He has appeared on the appellate side and original side of the High Court, Bombay, in writ petitions under Article 226 and 227 of the Constitution of India, conducted cases under Excise Act, in CGAT and in the High Court, appeared in the High Court in cases under Companies Act, Land Acquisition Act, Resettlement of Project Affected Persons Act, Maharashtra Regional Town Planning Act, Bombay Tenancy and Agriculture Lands Act, Bombay Public Trust Act, Public Premises Eviction Act, appeared in criminal appeals, habeas corpus petitions, summary suits in the High Court and also in cases under testamentary jurisdiction of the High Court. He was a part-time lecturer in New Law College, Mumbai from 1985 to 1991 and visiting professor, Department of Law, University of Mumbai from 1992 to 1995. He was elevated as High Court Judge on 12th October 2001. He was an executive chairman of the Maharashtra State Legal Services Authority, Mumbai. He was a chairman of the Main Mediation Committee, Bombay High Court, and also a director of Maharashtra Judicial Academy. Chairman of the Committee Monitoring Functioning of the Juvenile Justice Boards in the state of Maharashtra. Chairman of the Governing Council, Government Law College. He was acting Chief Justice of the Bombay High Court from 2nd December 2015 to 9 December 2015 and from 15 January 2016 to 20th January 2016. As a judge of Bombay High Court, he delivered more than 34,000 judgments and more than 1,200 judgments are reported in law reports. At present, he has been appointed as an arbitrator in 30 matters referred by Bombay High Court and Honorable Supreme Court of India. He is on the panel of arbitrators prepared by the Honorable Bombay High Court and also on the panel of IMC International ADR Center, Mumbai. He was appointed as an administrator of the Maharashtra Cricket Association from 11th March 2018 to 15 September 2018. He has been invited to participate and give representation in international seminars held in Bangkok and Phuket in Thailand in 2014 and 2015. At Singapore, organized on behalf of Commonwealth countries in 2014. And also in seminar on commercial litigations held at Hong Kong in 2016. He has attended several national seminars in Mumbai, Delhi, Madras, Jaipur, Cochin and Chandigarh. A very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you. I hope that there is no interruption. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yeah. So, good evening, all of you. Lawyers from Pune, Mumbai, judicial officers from all over Maharashtra. The weather is inclement and I hope that we enjoy this webinar. See, I've been asked to speak on a subject which is very vast, namely the law of writs. What I propose to do is, I do not propose to give you a lecture on law of writs. I would rather like to speak to you and share to you my thoughts, my experience as a lawyer and as a judge of the Bombay High Court on my experience in writ matters And I would request you to prepare your questions after the lecture is over so that wherever there is any difficulty or a query, I can answer it to the best of my knowledge. Now, what I propose to do is, I propose to discuss this subject in three parts. The first part is the general part, namely the historical background in respect of law of writs. Number two, I would like to go to the provisions, the procedure which is followed in issuance of writ, both the procedural law and the substantive law in relation to law of writs. And finally, the case law which has evolved over the last 60, 70 years after writ jurisdiction was conferred on the Supreme Court and the High Court of all each states. Now let us first, before I go to the historical background, understand what is the meaning of a writ. Now a writ essentially is a written order in the form of a letter which was in the past issued by the king, directing his subordinates and officers to execute that order. In England, generally, this power of issuance of writs, which were known as prerogative writs, vested in the king, the sovereign. And these writs were five in nature, namely writ of mandamus, writ of certiorari, writ of habeas corpus, writ of quo warranto, writ of prohibition. And later on, when the sovereign became a titular head, these writs were issued in his name by the High Court and Supreme Court of England. Now, one must remember here that in England, Parliament is supreme and the legislation made by the Parliament cannot be questioned in any court of law. And the right is exercised only by the Parliament to amend the Act or statute. But that is not the case in India. In India and in USA, the high courts have the power to even question the legislature, the legislation, and when it is challenged on the ground that it is ultra virus, the Constitution of India, ultra virus fundamental rights, and that the procedure prescribed is not proper and just. So there is a major distinction between English law and Indian law. Now, when the Constitution was enacted, before that a Constituent Assembly was formed, and we have a written constitution, unlike the British Constitution, which is an unwritten constitution. Very often, people are puzzled by this term, unwritten constitution. Essentially, it means that there is no written constitution like the Constitution of India, which contains in one statute all the provisions for the administration of how the executive, legislature, and the judiciary is supposed to function, and various other powers which are vested in authority. In England, however, there are several acts of Parliament which, in its combined nature, form the Constitution. So, for citizenship, there is a different act. For in respect of judiciary, there is a separate act, so on and so forth. So, therefore, it is known as an unwritten Constitution. Now, long time ago, when the monarchy prevailed all over the world, there was a concentration of power in one hand, and the king had the authority to issue various directions in the form of directions issued by the executive, issue executive orders, legislate, make legislation, make law, and finally adjudicate matters like the judiciary. Montesquieu and John Locke felt and propagated that this concentration of power in one individual is not advisable, because it is well known that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Even recently, during the Second World War, we have noticed that 6 million Jews were exterminated. And same thing happened in Russia when Stalin was in power, and he had a complete concentration of power both in Germany. Hitler had that power, and Stalin had. And there are several dictators who also enjoyed that kind of power, which allowed them to abuse the process of law. So therefore, John Locke and Montesquieu suggested that there should be separation of powers. Eventually, when democracy was established in England, these powers were therefore separated. Now one might wonder, why is it necessary to separate these powers? The answer is very simple. It is essential because of the human nature to abuse any power which is vested in a single individual. And it is always better to have a collective kind of responsibility, so that these powers are not concentrated in the hands of one person. So eventually, the judiciary was established, and judiciary has the obligation and authority to question the decisions of the executive in England, and in India and USA to question the decisions taken by the legislature and by the executive. So therefore, over a period of time, these powers have been bifurcated. And as you are aware that a right is given to an individual by a statute or by the constitution. And it is a well-known maxim that wherever there is a right, there has to be an equal efficacious remedy available. So therefore, under the Constitution of India, various rights have been given to individuals under the chapter, under part 3 of the Constitution, namely fundamental rights. So we have right of equality, right of freedom, right of proper procedure being followed under 21, so that no person is deprived of his life or liberty without a due process of law. So these rights have been given. Several rights also are given in respect of compensation for acquisition of property, and the procedures have been established giving the right of the parliament and the assembly. So there is a federal nature to our constitution, and legislative powers therefore are separated in the first 7th schedule in the form of list 1, list 2. List 1 is exercised by power of the central government, parliament, to enact law. List 2 is the power of the assembly, state assembly, to enact law. And list 3 is a concurrent list where both the parliament and the state can legislate on the subjects which are mentioned in that list. So our constitution is practically a blueprint of what we propose to do, and our goal, which is to be found in various chapters of the constitution. And whatever has to be achieved is also found in the directive principles of state policy. So what is the remedy therefore? Suppose there is a violation of a fundamental right. The remedy is to approach the High Court or the Supreme Court under Article 32. The Supreme Court has the power to enforce fundamental rights. The high courts of each state have a right to enforce fundamental rights and also issue various directions in the form of 5 prerogative writs and issue directions and orders in the nature of these writs. And so therefore, this remedy is to be found under Article 226 of the Constitution of India. This provision, article, has been interpreted right from 1950 when the Supreme Court was established, and the law under writ, the writ law, has evolved as a result of the case law, the decisions, the precedents which have been given by the Supreme Court and High Court for a period of time. And now, as of today, the writ law has practically surpassed each and every sphere and has also corrected the legislature whenever any law which has been passed which is contrary to the provisions of the Constitution of India. So therefore, before we go any further, I believe that it is necessary to understand the meaning of the 5 definition of the 5 prerogative writs which I mentioned earlier. These writs are, as I told you, writ of mandamus, writ of certiorari, writ of quo warranto, writ of prohibition, and habeas corpus. Let us very quickly see what these writs say. Now, a writ of mandamus is a writ which is issued to any public authority for the enforcement of a public duty which he has to discharge and where he has a legal obligation to perform or abstain from performing any legal obligation or a public duty. So it is in the nature of a command which is given to all authorities to do or not to do a particular act which is complained of. The primary prerogative before issuance of a writ of mandamus is to make a representation to that authority, demand justice, and if justice is not given, then that party has a right to approach the High Court under Article 226 of the Constitution of India. The second writ is the writ of certiorari. Writ of certiorari is a writ which is issued to subordinate quasi-judicial authorities, and it is for the purpose of quashing illegal orders, illegal directions which are given by these authorities, including the subordinate courts and the subordinate tribunals like the Central Administrative Tribunal, State Administrative Tribunal, and various other tribunals which have been established under law. And therefore, writ of certiorari essentially is issued when there is an error of law apparent on the face of record. Of course, in service matters, wherever any departmental inquiry is held and wherever in industrial law the decision is taken by the industrial court or a domestic inquiry, that power is very limited. The third writ is the writ of quo warranto. This writ can be issued to a appointing authority, asking that authority to inform the High Court as to the authority under which, jurisdiction under which an appointment has been made. For example, if the appointment of a vice chancellor is challenged, then the state government or the appointing authority which appoints the governor, appoints the vice chancellor, has to satisfy the court that proper procedure, due process has been followed. If a director general of police is appointed and if his appointment is challenged, then the state government, the home ministry, has to answer, has to inform the court as to the procedure which is followed by them. Then the next writ is a writ of prohibition. This writ normally is issued to lower authorities, particularly courts, prohibiting them from acting in an illegal manner. And lastly, writ of habeas corpus. Writ of habeas corpus essentially is a writ which is issued for the purpose of ensuring that no person is illegally detained. Now, unlike the other four writs, writ of habeas corpus can be also issued against a private person or a private authority. And if a person is illegally detained, say by the father-in-law, and if he detains his daughter who is legally married, the husband can issue a writ of habeas corpus asking the court to direct the father-in-law to produce his wife in the court and question as to under what authority she has been detained. Now, of course, if she comes to the court and tells the court that she is willingly staying with her father because of the domestic violence, then the High Court has to respect the wishes of the wife. But the point is that such a writ can be issued, such habeas corpus writ can be issued to a private person. Now, before we go any further, let us try to understand when a writ petition can be filed and against whom it can be filed. Now, one thing we have to note here is that there is no code of writ procedure, as we have the code of civil procedure and code of criminal procedure. The procedure has evolved over a period of time in England and America, and we have also formed our own procedure in the form of precedents given by the Supreme Court and the High Court. So the first question is, against whom a writ can be issued? Now it is quite well settled, as I told you, except a writ of habeas corpus. A writ petition or a writ can be filed against a state authority, legislature, or instrumentality of the state. Now, in order to see the definition of state, one has to go to Article 12 of the Constitution of India, which defines what is a state. So this definition becomes very important, and the Supreme Court has interpreted this provision and has given the list of authorities against whom a writ can be issued, namely state authorities. So therefore, let us quickly read the definition of Article 12, because once you understand the definition of Article 12, you will know against whom a writ can be filed. For those of you who have practiced mainly in the district courts and trial courts or in taluka courts, may not have the experience of drafting a writ petition and may not really know who should be the parties to a writ petition. I am telling this to all the junior lawyers. I am quite sure that senior lawyers are quite very well aware of the basics of writ law, but this is for the benefit of those who never had an experience of filing or dealing in writ law. So Article 12 says, in this part, unless the context otherwise requires, the state includes the government and the Parliament of India and the government and the legislature of each of the states and all local or other authorities within the territory of India or under the control of India. So therefore, this definition clearly defines, it's an expansive definition, and it mentions that a state means the state government, central government, legislature of both parliament and assembly, local authorities, or any other authority over which the state has complete control. Over a period of time, this definition has been interpreted, and now the Supreme Court has laid down that even instrumentalities of the state are amenable to the writ jurisdiction. I received a phone call if I think this link was cut. Hello.
Sir, we can hear you.
That's right. So therefore, the word instrumentalities of the state has been defined, and it means that such institutions, authorities, which are under the direct control, financial and regulatory, of the state government would be an instrumentality of the state. We find that in the case of Ajay Hasya, which is reported in AR 1981 Supreme Court, the Supreme Court has, and I would request all of you to briefly go through the said precedent, said case law. Supreme Court has held that even if an institution is under the direct control of the state government or the central government, if the funds are given to that institution by the government, then such authority would be an instrumentality of the state. Now, in this case, what had happened was that there was a medical college that was established in Jammu and Kashmir, and the state government used to give funds to this institution, which was a cooperative society, for the purpose of making payments to its professors. It was a medical college. They used to run a medical college, and there some kind of permit. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you, sir.
You can hear me, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
That's
we
right.
can hear you, only the video I think is
Okay. Yeah, video is stuck, I believe. It's stuck.
yes.
They will, so it's stuck.
Yes, we can hear you, sir. We can hear you clearly. Only
Okay.
problem is the video.
Okay, doesn't matter. So, as I was saying, therefore, in Ajay Hasya, the definition of instrumentality of a state has been given, and all such authorities or institutions, even if it's a cooperative society, if it is directly under the control of the state government or the central government, then a writ can be issued to such authorities. In that case, a student had appeared had applied for admission. There was a written test, and interview was also taken. The person who was interviewing this boy had just given him 2 or 3 minutes, and though he had fared very well in the written test, because of the low marks which he got in the interview, his admission to him was denied. So the Supreme Court set aside that order and directed them to again take his interview and take a decision in accordance with law. Of course, as I told you, a writ cannot be issued to a private person. The first judgment which was delivered by the Supreme Court in this case was in the case of Praga Tools. It's a decision of 1969 reported in AR 1969, where this law as to whether a writ can be issued to a private person or not has been thoroughly discussed. That was a case where there was a company in which certain percentage of shares were owned by the government, and there was an agreement between the workers and the company, and after some point of time, number of persons were retrenched. So a writ was filed, and it was said that the company had shares which were owned by the state government, and therefore writ could be issued. The Supreme Court said that so far as retrenchment is concerned, an alternate remedy was there, and secondly, a company, though certain percentage of shares were owned by the state government, would still be a private person because it was registered under the Companies Act 1956, and therefore the Supreme Court declined to issue a writ for setting aside the order of retrenchment which was passed by the company, and gave the petitioners remedy, gave them liberty to approach the appropriate forum for the redressal of their grievance. So therefore, one other important fact which needs to be noticed is that normally whenever there is an alternate remedy available, the High Court refuses to entertain that writ petition and directs the petitioner to first exhaust his alternate remedy which is available to him. So therefore, whenever, of course, there have been cases, the Supreme Court has now said that if there is a violation of fundamental right and that alternate remedy is not an efficacious remedy, then the High Court under certain circumstances and the Supreme Court can entertain that writ petition. So alternate remedy itself is not a complete bar for the purpose of the High Court entertaining its jurisdiction. There is one other rule, namely that the objection for the purpose of exercise of jurisdiction on the ground that there is alternate remedy available has to be taken at the first available instance. And if the matter is admitted, a rule is granted, then at the final hearing stage, the High Court will not permit the respondent to raise this particular objection. As you are aware, even under civil law, where there is a lack of territorial jurisdiction or lack of pecuniary jurisdiction, then that objection has to be taken within a particular period of time. And if it is not taken, then the court will not permit the parties to raise that objection. Of course, that is not true in respect of inherent lack of jurisdiction, and it is well settled that such a power can be exercised by the Supreme Court even for the first time if there is an inherent lack of jurisdiction. For example, if there is a criminal court has jurisdiction to decide a particular matter and it is filed in the civil court, or if it is a matter pertaining to an employee in a factory or a company and it is not filed before the labor court but before a civil court, and the civil court decides that matter of illegal termination, then even in the Supreme Court, if that objection is raised for the first time, then even then the Supreme Court, on that ground of inherent lack of jurisdiction, can decide whether the court had the jurisdiction or not. So therefore, alternate remedy is also one of the aspects which need to be considered. Another point which has to be kept in mind before filing of a writ petition is to ensure that there are no disputed questions of fact. And if there are disputed questions of fact, then the High Court or the Supreme Court can refuse to entertain that writ petition. Now, you are aware that in a civil court, a plaint is filed and plaint contains the facts and not the law. And evidence is led in respect of disputed questions of fact. And on the basis of preponderance of probability, the civil court then arrives at a decision after going through the evidence which has been led by both the parties. But that can't be done in a writ court. And normally in a writ court, only those facts which are not disputed alone can be considered. And the court under Article 226 has to consider whether there is a violation of rights, whether the documents on which reliance is placed by the petitioner or by the respondents are undisputed documents, and then it can issue the writ which has been asked for. Nowadays, though we have 5 prerogative writs, one has to remember that under Article 226 of the Constitution of India, the High Courts in India not only have the right to issue prerogative writs, 5 writs, but also have a right to issue any other order or direction to any authority or person. So, therefore, the right under 226 is quite wide as compared to the right which is exercised by the Supreme Court under Article 32. And therefore, nowadays the normal rule is that the Supreme Court, if the writ petition is filed directly, would direct the petitioner to first exhaust his remedy under 226 and then approach the High Court and then approach the Supreme Court under Article 136 read with 32. So therefore, the power under 226 is quite wide, and the High Court can, under various circumstances, issue writs. Now, over a period of time, this power has expanded, and we find that even in cases of administrative law, the only remedy which is available to a person where there is abuse of the process of law by administrative authorities, the remedy is available in the nature of writ petitions. You see, in the beginning of the 20th century or even in the 19th century, after the advent of industrial revolution, several factories were established. Then there were motor carriages, horse carriages. A municipality was established. Municipal authorities issued various directions, issued licenses. The police authorities issued licenses. And for the purpose of establishing or constructing buildings, tenders were issued. For the purpose of sewage, tenders were issued, because tender process is the normal process. And in such tender process, if there was any irregularity, then the only remedy which was available to an aggrieved person was to approach the High Court under 226 of the Constitution of India. So therefore, administrative law has also expanded over a period of time, and the High Court and the Supreme Court can issue various directions to highest administrative authorities who have the right and who have the discretion whether to grant a license or not to grant a license. And even if a particular statute gives unfettered discretion to an administrative authority, then the remedy which is available to a citizen or a resident is to approach the High Court under 226. So administrative law has also evolved over a period of time, and we find that several writ petitions are filed challenging the tender process and the procedure which is followed in the by the authorities, administrative authorities, in issuing tender to a person. There is a third category of cases which has evolved, namely public interest litigation. Now, what is a public interest litigation? In the year 1982, when the Asian Games were held in Delhi, a large number of contractors were appointed to execute the work at the Asiad Stadium. And these persons brought laborers from Andhra Pradesh, from Haryana, from Jaipur, Rajasthan, and several other places near Delhi. And they were practically working in unhygienic conditions. They were not being paid, and therefore, one person, activist, who had noticed these things, wrote a letter to the Chief Justice that I think at that time he had written a letter to Justice Bhagwati, not the Chief Justice. And Justice Bhagwati took cognizance of this postcard letter which was sent. Now, as you are aware, that no evidence can be laid in a writ petition, and therefore he appointed a commission, appointed some prominent people to go and inspect the premises, take interviews of all those workers who were working there. After the report was submitted by the commissioners who were appointed to examine the workers and the condition under which they were working, the Supreme Court made several persons, including contractors who were working there, and the central government, parties, including the state government, and then asked them to file their affidavit. So, therefore, a new form of litigation emerged. The main character of this petition was that several people who are economically, socially backward and who are not in a position to approach the court because of their disability, they can be represented by an activist or an NGO or a responsible person who can seek redressal of their grievance in the form of a public interest litigation. In this type of litigation, therefore, the normal rule of locus standi is given a go by. Normally, a person who is aggrieved by any order alone can approach the court, so that if he comes forward with a case which is false, he can be penalized, cost can be imposed. If he has made a false statement on oath, perjury proceedings can be initiated against him. But in a PIL, people who are aggrieved cannot approach the court because of their economic disability, because of their social disability. And in such cases, the High Court under 226 can entertain such a petition where the petitioner doesn't have a locus to approach the court, and then issue directions. Surprisingly, over a period of time, the number of PILs which have been filed in the High Court have increased. And subsequently, the Supreme Court had to note, had to give directions that and found that several such PILs were filed by persons who tried to seek vengeance, disgruntled persons who had lost or to whom tenders were not allotted, put up persons, third parties, to file PILs challenging the contract which was awarded to certain persons. These petitions were filed at a very late stage. There was a gross delay in filing of these petitions, so that if they succeeded, the person to whom contract was awarded would lose a lot of money. Essentially, it was filed to seek vengeance or to settle political scores or personal scores. Supreme Court therefore now has said that if it finds out, ultimately comes to a conclusion that this is politically or personally motivated, then in that case it can issue costs and give certain directions to the state government to proceed against the said petitioner. So I had an occasion to deal with number of PILs, and I must tell you my personal experience that almost 80% of these PILs are petitions which are filed by disgruntled elements, are frivolous petitions, publicity seeking petitions, and therefore one has to be very careful, the court has to be very careful while issuing orders in a PIL. So these are the various types of petitions which have evolved over a period of time. Now, another aspect is the procedure which is followed while entertaining. Now, as you are aware, that the Evidence Act is not applicable, the Code of Civil Procedure is not applicable to writ petitions, and the procedure has been evolved. And the High Court has framed its own rules, either on the original side or on the appellate side. And we have the appellate side rules and the original side rules, which have laid down the procedure as to how a writ petition is to be filed, the stamp duty which is payable on the filing of a writ petition. Earlier, only a stamp duty of ₹50 was to be paid. Now I believe it has increased. And therefore it was a cheap remedy which was available to a person whose fundamental rights are violated, or his statutory rights are violated, or there is a violation of principles of natural justice. Now, so far as jurisdiction is concerned, if you read the provisions of Article 226, I'll quickly go through the said provision. It says that notwithstanding anything contained in Article 32, every High Court shall have power. Now these are important words. Throughout the territories in the relation to which it exercises jurisdiction, to issue to any person or authority, including in appropriate cases any government, within whose territories directions, orders, or writs, including the 5 prerogative writs, for the enforcement of any rights conferred by Part 3. And subclause 2 mentions that the High Court jurisdiction in relation to the territories within which cause of action wholly or in part arises. So therefore, there is a rider. The state government normally cannot exercise jurisdiction beyond the territories of its state. But then subclause 2 mentions that the cause of action has to arise wholly or in part in the territory within which that particular act has happened. I must tell you that over a period of time, criminal writ law also has expanded. And I remember a case which came up before me. It was a case under criminal writ jurisdiction in which the husband and wife had filed several cases against each other. The girl was staying in Madhya Pradesh and the boy was staying in Mumbai. And every time a new case was filed, criminal case or civil case under domestic violence, either the boy or the girl had to travel to the states, to Madhya Pradesh or to Mumbai. And totally 72 cases were filed against each other by both the parties, in which they had made parties their mother-in-law, father-in-law, sister-in-law, and several other. Finally, when the matter came up before me, I called them to my chamber for the purpose of settlement. And with great difficulty, I was in a position to persuade them that it was not worthwhile to keep on fighting like this. They were inflicting insult and injury to each other and their families. So finally, both decided that by consent, both these petitions filed in Madhya Pradesh and Mumbai High Court can be quashed. So, taking uh, advantage of subclause 2 of Article 226, I took the view that since part of the cause of action had arisen in Mumbai because they were married in Mumbai, they had stayed in Mumbai for a long time, and the boy used to visit Mumbai, the girl used to visit Mumbai, and then she went to Indore. Taking advantage of that, all the 72 cases were quashed by me under Article 226 of the Constitution of India. And both the families had come, and after the matter was disposed of, they were all very happy that a bitter chapter had come to an end. So there are exceptional cases where the part of the jurisdiction has arisen in other states. The High Court has entertained a writ petition in a different state and has issued directions. So jurisdiction therefore is normally limited to cause of action which is arisen in the state in which the High Court is situated. Then the second point, apart from jurisdiction, is limitation. Now, the Limitation Act is not applicable to writ law, and over a period of time, the law which has evolved is that the limitation which is prescribed for filing of an appeal, namely 90 days, is the rule for filing limitation. Of course, the High Court has entertained writ petitions beyond a period of 90 days if it has found that the representation has been made for issuance before issuance of writ of mandamus, and that representation was not decided within a reasonable period of time, and thereafter the High Court has entertained that writ petition. So there is no hard and fast rule, but by and large, if there is a delay cause which is not explained, sufficient explanation has not been given, then the High Court will refuse to entertain that writ petition on the ground of limitation. Now, as I have told you, Evidence Act is not applicable, and the pleadings are in the form of affidavits. Similarly, there is no written statement, but an affidavit in reply has to be filed to the averments which are made in the writ petition. The normal rule is that these averments which are found in the petition have to be controverted. If not, para-wise, at least by a general statement mentioning that whatever is mentioned in the writ petition is not admitted. And of course, if certain directions are to be issued, the court has to ensure that there are no disputed questions of fact. And only thereafter, directions can be issued. So the point is that so far as the procedure is concerned, the court has to first ensure whether the writ petition is maintainable, whether the party or parties which are there are private parties or state or its instrumentalities. So because of this, in respect of several statutes where decisions are taken by government or its authorities, a writ is maintainable. So you can challenge the acquisition proceedings which are initiated under the Land Acquisition Act by the Special Land Acquisition Officer or under the Regional and Town Planning Act. Then several tribunals have been established. For example, the Central Administrative Tribunal and State Administrative Tribunal. Initially, when the Act was passed in 1985, there was a clear provision that against an order passed by the tribunal, no writ would be maintainable in the High Court and an appeal can be filed in the Supreme Court. But later on, the Supreme Court held that the power of the High Court under 226 and 227 cannot be abrogated by any statute, and therefore a writ could be filed against an order of the tribunal to the High Court. So I believe that this is the basic law which has evolved of writ petitions. Now, over and above that, so far as fundamental rights are concerned, these rights also have been interpreted in extenso. For example, right of equality. Now, right of equality mentions that no person can be discriminated and there has to be equality before the law and equal procedure which is established. But over a period of time, this particular article was interpreted and even arbitrary action, an action which is antithesis of equality, namely arbitrariness, can also be challenged while challenging that there is a violation of Article 14. And you will find, if you read Sirvai on writ law on the Constitution of India, Jyoti Basu, Professor Basu, has practically discussed at great length each of these articles. And partly we have followed judgments of US Supreme Court, English courts, while interpreting these provisions. Article 19 and 21 also has been the subject matter of discussion in A.K. Gopalan and several other judgments. In Maneka Gandhi, where her passport was impounded and she was not allowed to travel abroad, the Supreme Court has considered the Passport Act at length and finally came to the conclusion that not only the Act should be proper and should not be in violation of fundamental rights, but the procedure which is followed while taking a decision has to be just, fair and reasonable. And if the procedure is not just, fair and reasonable, then that particular provision can be struck down on that ground. Then we have judgments where Keshwananda Bharati's case, where the question was whether there can be an abrogation of fundamental rights. The Supreme Court decided that by a 13-bench judgment, and each judge delivered his judgment. and considered the various facets of the Constitution of India and held that there has to be a basic structure, there is a basic structure which can't be violated. Then, of course, there was this issue about the primacy of fundamental rights over directive principles. The initial judgments, if you notice, are such that the fundamental rights will have primacy. But later on, as the law evolved, you will notice that the Supreme Court has taken a view that directive principles, though they are not enforceable, are guiding lights for the purpose of examining the legality of any statute. And even if it is ultra virus, the directive principles, on that ground also, the Supreme Court or the High Court can strike it down. So if it is violative of Article 39A and B, on that ground also, in the state of Vaman versus Maharashtra, state of Maharashtra, in the case of Vaman versus state of Maharashtra, Supreme Court has taken that view. So, friends, the law in the respect of writs is so vast that it will take a lifetime to consider all the aspects and nuances of writ law. And once you develop a liking for understanding the writ law, you'll notice that it is very interesting, though initially you may find it difficult. I believe that 1 hour is over, and I can go on citing various judgments and taking into consideration various aspects of writ law. But I believe that we should stop here and let us have an interactive session. Yes, yes, Mr. Badbade.
Sir, thank you very much for enlightening us. Sir, there are certain questions which are flooding in. I think Sujata will take the questions, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, certainly.
Sir, the first question is from Mr. Naveen Bhatia. He says, sir, whether writ petition can be filed against cooperative housing society.
Normally, since a cooperative housing society is a private entity, and since there is an alternate remedy of approaching the cooperative court, normally a writ petition would not be maintainable. There is a very beautiful judgment which has been delivered by the Supreme Court and which is to be found in AR 1999 Supreme Court, I don't remember, where it has made a distinction between those cases where a suit can be filed. And if the court comes to a conclusion that a suit can be filed against that action, then the remedy would be to file a suit. Similarly, in the respect of cooperative courts, cooperative societies, if a resolution passed in a cooperative society can be challenged under Section 91 of the Cooperative Societies Act, then a writ would not be maintainable. But I believe that under the Maharashtra Regional Town Planning Act also, there is a provision which states that suit is maintainable and suit is not maintainable. And there are two judgments of our High Court, one given by Justice Parshikar, as he then was, and one other judgment where this issue has been considered. So similarly, in the case of a cooperative society, for example, if a building is constructed under the MHADA Act, and thereafter a cooperative society is formed, and later on there is a demolition of that cooperative society, and if there is a dispute regarding its layout, etc., then the High Court has entertained, because the writ can be issued against the cooperative, against MHADA, and the cooperative society can be made a party. So it all depends on the provisions under which the cooperative society is formed. And but as a matter of rule, if there is an alternate remedy available, then you have to first exhaust that remedy. Yes.
Thank you, sir. The next question, I do not have the name of the participant, but I'm going to read his question as is. He says, as Justice Kanade has said during ongoing lecture, that High Court cannot entertain writ petition involving disputed questions of fact, but the
Correct.
Supreme Court in the recent judgment in the matter of Popatrao Patil versus State of Maharashtra has taken a
Mhm.
view that high courts are not precluded from entertaining writ petitions even if there are disputed questions of facts are involved. And then his question says whether the said law is applicable to particular facts or we can use the same as present in law.
No, I did not have the benefit of reading that judgment, so it may be a very recent judgment. But the normal rule is disputed questions of fact, if are found in the petition is not maintainable. But as rightly pointed out now by the Supreme Court, it appears that even in respect of disputed questions of fact, High Court can entertain a petition. But I believe that this must be by way of an exception where uh, question of law is involved and the disputed questions of fact do not really matter for the purpose of deciding that law and for the purpose of issuing a direction or a writ in the nature of the 5 writs or orders which can be passed by the High Court. I believe that unless I read that judgment, I would not be in a position to make a general comment as to whether this general rule is given a go by the Supreme Court, because over a last period of 50, 60 years, this has been the rule that high courts will not entertain. And I don't think, though I have not read the judgment, that this essential rule has been given a go by the Supreme Court. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Mr. Kotak. He says High Court is not entertaining writ with respect to tender. Any suggestion
With
how
respect to, with respect
tender,
to
tender,
tender.
tender.
Yeah, yeah.
Any suggestion how how a party can pursue with the High Court for the same? And so he's also requested you to touch up with between the difference between Article 226 and 227.
Yeah. You see, first I'll answer his question regarding to interference by the High Court in issuance of tender. Now, the first judgment on this point is given in Ramanna Shetty versus Airport Authority of India, reported in 1979 Supreme Court. There were 2 questions. One, whether a writ could be issued against Airport Authority of India. Supreme Court held that it's an instrumentality of the state and therefore it is amenable to writ jurisdiction. The second point which came up for discussion in Ramanna Shetty was whether the issuance of a tender can be questioned before the High Court or the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that though the High Court doesn't have the right to, the right is very restricted. The question is whether due process has been followed. So decision-making process, if it is not followed, then the High Court can interfere and issue directions. Now, this law over a period of time has been expanded by various judgments. And at one time, the rule was that a person who has given the lowest tender should be awarded that tender. But later on, Justice Sujata Manohar, sitting as a senior judge, I don't remember the name of that judgment, has considered law of tenders and has said that ultimately most of these government undertakings are commercial ventures, companies which are carrying on commercial activity. And it has to consider not only the lowest tender, but it has to see whether the amount which is quoted in the tender is proper. And if the corporation finds that a particular tender which is quoted has quoted high amount than the lowest tender, but in the long run it is a proper tender and the quality of work would be different, then tender can be awarded to such a person and the High Court should not interfere. So therefore, this law has evolved, and now the Supreme Court has said that it is for the corporation or for the government company to consider what is right, what is wrong, and therefore there has been a growing tendency of not interfering with the tender process unless it is found that the decision making process is flawed. If it is not, because ultimately it entails in the delay in execution of public works. Sometimes we find in dictatorial countries, communist countries like China and some other countries where there is dictatorship, public works are executed in a speedy manner. But in India, we find that petitions are filed, ad interim order is passed, and then the matter remains pending for a long time. I remember one case which I had decided was in the respect of a bridge, and only one small portion of that bridge was not constructed because of some religious structure. And finally, both the parties agreed, and the religious structure was shifted, and that work was completed. So there is reluctance also because of stalling of public projects that the courts are slow in interfering with the tender process. And what was the second question? What was the second?
Whether the said law is applicable to particular facts or we can use the same as present in law.
No. In this, so far as tender question is concerned, he had also asked some other question.
Uh,
He had,
Sir, sorry, I'm so sorry, sir.
yes.
He wanted to know the difference between Article 226 and 227.
Yeah. You see, so far as Article 226 is concerned, that is a power, wide power given to the High Court. And normally, under 227, the High Court has a power of superintendence. That is, it can correct the errors which are committed by tribunals and other such authorities, quasi-judicial authorities. And writ of certiorari is issued. Now, writ of certiorari is essentially issued if there is an error of law apparent on the face of record inter alia. And a direction can be given to the tribunal or to the lower courts or lower authorities while issuing a writ of certiorari. Over a period of time, the distinction between 227, certiorari under 227 and 226 has been eliminated by virtue of the judgments of the Supreme Court. Essentially, these judgments were delivered in respect of cases where a writ of latest patent appeal was maintainable against a single judge's order. And in the light of that, all those decisions have been given. Because there was a judgment of the Supreme Court, I forget the name of the judgment, where Supreme Court has said that so far as writ under 226 and 227 is concerned, latest patent appeal is not maintainable. Later on, that distinction was made, and some courts held that it was maintainable. Particularly in courts like Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, Delhi, where they have there is a single judges decide cases, writ petitions, and against that a latest patent is maintainable. But now latest patent has been abolished, and so therefore there are several judgments. I can't give the citations offhand, where a distinction has been made between certiorari under 226 and certiorari under 227. So please refer to those judgments. Now you can uh, study. You can make a search online and get those judgments very fast. In our days, when we started our practice, we had to go to the digest and then search for them. But if you go online, either on SCC online or Mandupatra, you will get those judgments. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Advocate Satyadev Joshi. He has requested you to speak on the letter patents with respect to writ petitions.
Now the law is quite settled now. The latest patent appeal has been abolished, not only in respect of civil matters, but also in respect of writ petitions. And now all matters under 226 and 227 directly have to go for the division bench, where a petition is filed under both 226 and 227. The matter comes before the division bench of the High Court. So therefore, now that issue has become redundant and infructuous, and therefore, there is no question of now filing a writ petition under an appeal under latest patent, even in respect of writ petition. This is my humble view, unless the Supreme Court has said otherwise recently.
Thank you, sir. The next question, Mr. Kotak wants to know, he has requested you to explain more with respect to writs filed for business and political motive.
In PIL,
Is
is it so far as PIL matter or any other writ petition?
Mr. Kotak, are you there?
Is it in respect of PIL or in respect of ordinary writ petition?
With respect to writs, so the question just says, with respect to writ filed for political and business motive.
Normally, such writs can be filed only as a PIL, public interest litigation. And the court has to, exercising jurisdiction under that particular article, has to examine whether there are any mala fide intentions. On the basis of pleadings in the PIL, the reply which is filed, the documents which are annexed by the respondents, and if it comes to a conclusion that it is filed with a mala fide intention of settling political scores, then the High Court refuses to entertain such writ petitions. But nowadays what is happening is that people put up several persons who pose themselves as activists and then challenge the decision which is given in favor of one party. So there can be political vendetta or even business vendetta. I remember I had a case, I was sitting with Chief Justice Bedi, who went to the Supreme Court, and we had a matter before us where there was a building, there was a tender issued in respect of erection of a building having car parking and partly of a mall, and the building was completely constructed, and later on few people challenged that allotment of tender to the respondent. The respondent then made an allegation that this was filed. Firstly, there was a gross delay in filing of that, and they were very well aware that the building was coming up. And in spite of that, after the completion of the building, this PIL was filed. So therefore, we took the view that there was a delay in filing the PIL, and secondly, it was motivated by business rivalry, and therefore we refused to entertain the petition. Also, of course, we decided on merits also, but this was also one of the grounds that it has been filed on account of business rivalry. So it can be a ground for dismissal of a petition. But then if it is established that despite that there is some substance then in such cases the High Court appoints an amicus curiae to independently make its submissions if it finds that there is some public interest involved. So it depends on the facts of each case.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
sir. The next question is from Ms. Pragati. Is res judicata applicable to writ jurisdiction?
Yes, certainly it is applicable. The principles which are analogous to section 11 of the Civil Procedure Code are also applicable to writ petitions, and the principles of res judicata and constructive res judicata are equally applicable. The Supreme Court in 1978 went to the extent of saying that even in the respect of civil applications which are filed, and if a civil application has been dismissed, you can't after some time file a similar civil application seeking similar reliefs. Res judicata is certainly, principles of res judicata are applicable.
Thank you, sir. The next question from Advocate Zoshi. I'm going to read it as is. Sir, can under writ jurisdiction courts interfere with the policy decision of the government? If yes, to what extent? What would be the principle guiding such matters?
See, normally the rule is that in respect of policy matters, in respect of strictly administrative decisions which are taken by the government, state or its instrumentality, the High Court will refuse to entertain such a petition. But what is known as the Wednesbury principle, that is, if it is so patently unreasonable, if it is violative of fundamental rights, if it is arbitrary and violates the fundamental rights of an individual, then even in respect of policy matters, the law is that the High Court can entertain and declare that, but normal rule is that the High Court will not interfere. Take for example, I'm just giving an example. Suppose there is a college and it has a principal, and the principal takes a decision to allot one room for students of one division, where the room is small and the number of students in that division is also less. So such decisions as to which class is to be held, the timetable, etc., are administrative matters. And in respect of such administrative, I'm just giving an example. The principal of a college is not a state, but just I'm giving an example. That in respect of such administrative decisions, the High Court doesn't interfere. And if a policy decision is accordingly taken for administrative purposes, then the High Court will never interfere in such cases. Yes.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Advocate Tanuj Loda. He says, sir, can you please explain stages in a writ petition hearing for the benefit of junior advocates?
No, I have not followed.
So he wants to know the stages in a writ petition hearing.
Right. And normally, see, there was a time when I started my practice in 1979. In those days, the number of writ petitions were filed were less. There were no PILs. And hardly there used to be a board of 15, 20, 25 matters, writ petitions. And within a period of 6 months to 1 year, those matters were decided, finally. So therefore, in those days, the practice was to admit it, or in other words, to issue rule nisi. Now the meaning of the rule nisi is that to rule means notice. Notice to the respondents, informing them that the matter will now come up for final decision, and if they want to file any reply, they should do so within that particular period, within a period of 6 months. Rule nisi, rule made returnable after 4 weeks or 8 weeks. So that means the matter would come after 8 weeks for final hearing. But of course, in those days, the matters, if not within 8 weeks, it used to come for hearing within 6 months. But now the position has changed. Over a period of time, the number of matters which have been filed has increased exponentially. And therefore, the tendency of the courts nowadays is to dispose of writ petitions at the admission stage itself without issuing of rule. But once rule is issued, the matter will come up after 10 years because of the pendency. So therefore, in order to ensure justice is done, the court directs that issuance of rule is waived by the respondent. Respondents to file a reply within 4 weeks, rejoinder if any to be filed within 4 weeks thereafter, matter to be placed for finally. Even such matters which are to be disposed of at admission stage sometimes remain pending for 2-3 years. But at least instead of issuing rule, they are decided early. So therefore there are two stages. One is for the issuance of ad interim order. Subclause 2 of Article 226 mentions that if ad interim relief is ex parte ad interim relief is given, then notice has to be given to the other side who has a right to apply for vacating that ad interim order. If the ad interim order is confirmed, then the next stage is for final hearing at the admission stage or after service of rule. So therefore, the procedure now has changed, but because of the huge pendency of matters, which is because now you see what has happened is, as far as possible, people try to convert even a suit into a writ petition because one, the stamp duty is less. Number two, there are technicalities such as the Evidence Act, Limitation Act are not applicable, and there is a quick, efficacious remedy which is available. Very often, by issuance of ad interim orders, the matter itself is disposed of. Suppose the representation is filed and it is not decided, the court directs the authority to decide the representation within a particular time and it can dispose of. So therefore, there is no question of evidence being led, and that part is not applicable in the writ petition. So these are the two stages, either at the admission stage itself or at the final hearing, admit and then decided at the final. These are the two stages in which the petition can be disposed of.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
The next question. So this particular participant, he has two orders from the Supreme Court, one of 2009 and the other of 2017, ordering the High Court to resolve the matter within six months and 4 months. But the High Court, he says, is not taking up the matter. So he says, can he file a writ petition in the Supreme Court with regard to this?
Supreme Court will not entertain it unless the Supreme Court has given a specific direction. See, now what has happened is, because of the pendency of matters, the courts are not getting time. See, in the writ board is like this. First, we have matters which have been circulated for urgent circulation. So that means, suppose there is an urgency and the corporation is going to demolish the structure unless there is an alternate remedy under 351. If there is a provision, there is no provision, then on that ground, he can come to the High Court and ask for an ad interim relief. Now, very often these urgent matters are almost 50 to 100 matters on board every day. So, very often these urgent matters are not disposed of. Then the second category is those matters where ad interim is granted or not granted and notices have been issued which have been served. So the second stage of hearings sometimes also takes time. The third category, of course, is Supreme Court expedited matters. Normally, precedence is given to these directions given by the Supreme Court. Though I must tell you that the Supreme Court has no administrative control over the High Court judges. And the High Court is independent. There is no question of the Supreme Court issuing, maintaining service record of High Court judges like the High Court does with the District Court. But still, over a period of time, the Supreme Court has been issuing such directions that decided within 2 weeks. If that happens, normally the High Court will entertain unless it is so pressed, it is so busy with some very urgent matters, more urgent than the Supreme Court expedited matters. Of course, going to the Supreme Court is possible, but then ultimately, if the High Court is entertaining that matter, you should make a request to the High Court in a very polite manner rather than telling the High Court, because prudence demands that when you go with a bowl, I'm not saying a begging bowl, but you go with a bowl to the court, you should be courteous to the court and not annoyed. Of course, High Court judges are not annoyed in that sense, but since they are also human beings, care should be taken that when you go there, you should make a request, a polite request to take up the Supreme Court expedited matters. So that is my view.
Thank you, sir. We have a lot of questions pouring in, but due to paucity of time, I'll read the last question.
Right.
It says, should a candidate file writ of PIL as the effective remedy against policy decisions affecting broad spectrum of the society and also the candidate? Example, the recent medical college admissions reservation issue in Maharashtra.
Yeah, certainly. And I think some petitions have been filed, some interim orders have been passed, they have gone to the Supreme Court. So far as educational matters are concerned, namely medical college admissions, engineering college admissions, set of rules have been framed by the government, including the amount of fees which are charged. And you will find that right from Preeti Jain 1984 Supreme Court has interfered and has given various directions from time to time. Though normally now the Supreme Court is slow in interfering with these matters, it has set a deadline. I think it is 30th of September, beyond which it will not entertain any petition, because the number of days which are lost by a student is much more, and therefore beyond that period it has now set a limit that it can't entertain a petition. The High Court or the Supreme Court doesn't entertain. So a writ certainly can be filed challenging these, but within the time prescribed by the Supreme Court now. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for conducting this lecture very adequately. I will request Advocate Makran to take over from here.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you, Sujata
I'm
madam.
sorry the video was not functioning. I don't know what happened.
No, that's
Anyway,
perfectly
yes.
fine.
Yes, please.
Yeah, it is my honor, sir, to propose a vote of thanks to all who made this webinar such a great success, in spite of the cyclone and technical difficulties which occurred because of
Yeah.
this cyclone. Yeah. So at the outset, really thank you, Your Lordship, Kanade sir, because you spread time for us, and you honored our request to really guide us on such a difficult topic such as a read petition. And you made it look so simple actually. That I'm sure most of our participants, all the juniors, will definitely be benefited because of that, and they will use this knowledge in their practice. So thank you very much. I think to sum up this, what we understand the meaning of writ petition, the various types such as mandamus, certiorari, quo warranto, writ prohibition, habeas corpus. So these are various types, and then you also guided us about the whole history, the procedure, the jurisdiction, limitation, and so on. You also guided us, sir, on various case laws such as Ajay Hastia, Pagra Tool, Maneka Gandhi, Keshavanand Bharati, Vaman versus State of Maharashtra, etc. And so this was really enlightening, and it was very wonderful to know so many aspects of writ petition. So thanks a lot, sir, from all of us. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank President of Bar Association of Maharera and Maharit, Mr. Advocate Harshad Bhadbade, and his team. I would also like to thank President of our RERA Practitioner Association Pune, Advocate Nilosh Borate, and other member of our study circle. And lastly, I would like to thanks all the participants for their overwhelming response. Sir, I mean, obviously, sir tried to answer most of the questions. I would request all the participants to leave their question in case they are not answered. You can leave your responses on our YouTube channel, and probably we'll try and answer those questions at later stage. Okay. So with this, we have come to an end. So thanks a lot for attending. Have a
Thank you. My privilege, my honor. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you,
Yes.
Lordship. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Friends, we have come to a conclusion of one more very enlightening session. In fact, it was so good, so powerful and so strong that even the Nisarga cyclone lost its way and has gone in a little different direction. So we could give full attention to sir, and we could listen with rapt every word, case law, example, illustration, history, background. It was really a wonderful session, sir. It was really a pleasure listening to you. And I think we should thank Harshad, sir, for inviting such a respectable, wonderful, renowned speaker to share his pearls of wisdom with us. Truly a wonderful session, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Friends, we have often come across this term, this new medicine called as remdesivir for corona, and there are different other kind of medicines which are being discussed, and patents are being discussed, and a trademark is being discussed, copyright issues are being discussed, medical procedures, geographical indicators, if you remember about champagne, turmeric, basmati rice. Very, very interesting topic. All of us have come across these issues in as far as intellectual property rights are concerned, copyrights, trademarks, and brands are concerned. So we have another fantastic session coming up tomorrow. That is at 3 o'clock by none other than Advocate Nishad Nadkarni, who's a senior partner at Ketan and Company. So this is going to be truly a wonderful session. I'm definitely looking forward to it, and I'm sure so are you. So see you once again tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Thank you very much and have a pleasant evening. Thank you.